Saint Lydwine of Schiedam by Joros Carl Huysmans, Chapter 16. In the train which carried my friends and me to Schiedam, I thought of the first edition of The Life of Lydwine by Johannes Brugman, which I had consulted in the library at La Haye. This volume, which is as thin as a tract, was printed at Schiedam at the expense of the builders of the Church of St. John the Baptist in 1498, that is to say, 65 years after the death of the saint, and it contains curious wood engravings, of which two may specifically be mentioned. The one represents Lydwine standing, dressed as a great lady of the 15th century, with a long crucifix in her hand, and in her left a branch of that rose bush which buds signified the number of days she had left to live. In front of her, seated on a wooden chair, is the good brother miner, Brugman, in the act of writing the book. But he is so absorbed and in such a hurry that he only looks at his manuscript and does not see the saint. The other picture shows Lydwine, older than she could have been at that time, stretched on her side and supported by two women, whilst the third stands transfixed with fright, and a man behind her draws the outlines of her limbs. To complete the little picture, some skaters appear on one side holding each other by the hand, and on the other side there is a tiny tower, indicated by a few strokes of the pencil. The xylographs, which have been carefully studied from the point of view of the history of engraving in the Low Country, appealed to me chiefly by their simplicity, but they were too small to suggest the aspect of the place in which the saint lived. Does her memory, so absolutely forgotten by the world in general, and almost forgotten in the Calvinist towns of Holland, still survive in Schiedam? Should I discover in this township where she was born and died any traces of her, the remains of the streets of her time, the site of her house, or any documents to bear those out which her first biographer gathered together so carelessly? I was ruminating thus while turning over the pages of a Baedeker, which devoted a few unenthusiastic lines to the description of Schiedam, and did not even mention the name of the saint. To tell the truth, I found Holland so unlike that which I had enjoyed in my childhood, and since a Holland rebuilt, with large towns full of avenues and new buildings, that I hoped for little from this excursion. Would it not be the same at Schiedam, which I had never yet visited? Probably it would. On the other hand, what marches and countermarches we had to make to enable us to hear Mass in these Protestant agglomerations. Were we in Lydwine's country going to have the same difficulty in these Protestant agglomerations? Were we in them possible, and yet my friends and I plucked a heart, for we knew that a much frequented pilgrimage took place in this district, the pilgrimage of the martyrs of Gorkum, that is to say, of 19 of the faithful, of whom 11 were Capuchins, 2 Prometarians, 1 a Dominican, 1 an Augustinian, and 4 secular priests, who had been hanged after frightful tortures in 1572 by the Reformed Church at Gorkum. They were beatified in 1675 and canonized in 1867. Their memory was so fresh that pilgrims always came to venerate their relics, and therefore a current of Catholicism must exist in the country. Now, Gorkum is not very far from Schiedam, and there was consequently a chance that either in going or coming back they might also do the reverence to the remains of the saint, and in that case there would certainly be at least a chapel. The answer to these questions was not long in declaring itself, for we had hardly left the train at Schiedam that evening than we perceived a vast church. Glad at the chance, we entered, but it was so dark that we could not distinguish anything even at 2 paces distance. Suddenly, as we groped our way along and asked ourselves if we were not in a heretic building, the light of a star shone at the end of the nave. The star moved and fixed itself in 6 different places in the air, and in the light that spread from the 6 candles above the altar, a colored statue emerged from the darkness, the statue of a woman crowned with a rose and accompanied by an angel. Doubt was no longer possible. As if to reassure us, Lydwine showed herself immediately upon our arrival, and whilst we were examining the apparition, the whole church became illuminated, and a crowd silently filled it. Men, women, and children entered by all doors, and pressed into the benches. The altar was covered with light, and whilst the priests displayed the Blessed Sacrament, majestic waves of praise came from the great organ, and the tantrum ergo intoned in plain chant by hundreds of voices mounted in clouds of incense among the pillars and under the arches. Then, after the benediction, The Lauduate was sung by the congregation. In the darkening church, fervent kneeling silhouettes were seen, clasping their hands in shadows. The benediction of the Blessed Sacrament. We were so accustomed to it in France that it no longer awakes any special sensations. We present ourselves happily to offer a proof of our affectionate deference to him, whose humility was such that he was born into the most vile race in the world, the race of the Jews, and that he consented to heal the sickness of the soul of his own people, to humble himself for the part of spiritual healer in the lowly aspect of a wafer bread. But in a strange land, where for weeks we may be without a church into which we can enter at all hours, amongst people who do not understand our language, the sensation of joy and peace we felt in hearing the Latin tongue of the church, and in finding ourselves suddenly again in the atmosphere of prayer, was truly exquisite. What astonished me, too, in this unknown sanctuary, was the number of men who were praying, and the ardent fervor of these Catholics whom we recognized as so deeply, so simply pious. Returning to the hotel, where the excellent people who received us were also Orthodox, we learned that Schiedam possesses 3 churches, and that St. Lydwine is the patroness and absolute mistress of the town. In that dining room of the Hoogstraat, where we felt so much at home and at our ease in a warm and comfortable corner, memories of a family and childhood came over me, called up by the scent of the room, that smell peculiar to the rooms in Holland, which is made up of gingerbread and tea, ginger and cinnamon, salt meat and smoke, an emanation at the same time sweet and bitter, which recalls to me so many friendly dining rooms and light repasts. All that is small and delicate in Holland rises up to greet us and to bid us, like Lydwine, whose celestial odors we recall, the most friendly of welcomes. The next day we went to visit the churches, and our surprise of the evening before was increased. It was not Sunday, and yet there were many at Mass, communicating either before or after the sacrifice, as is the custom here. Of these 3 churches, which were always full, 2 belonged to the Dominicans, who, in a Protestant country, cannot wear the dress of their orders, and one of these churches, dedicated to St. John the Baptist, was the one that we had entered the chancel on the previous evening. In daylight its charm would be gone, but if the life of prayer which animates it did not compensate for the vulgar ugliness of its nave, adorned with pillars with Tuscan capitals, it is of a melancholy, unclassifiable style, with the image of the saint which we saw in the half-light is of common painted plaster. The other church, that of the Rosary, is built half of brick, half of stone, and lighted by green glass. It is an awkward imitation of the Gothic style, but it is nevertheless lighter and more attractive than the others. The chapel, dedicated to St. Lydwine, is ornamented with glass, on which different episodes of her life are depicted, and by a statue, bought ready-made, which seems to have no resemblance to a work of art, whether seen close at hand or from a distance. Much the best church is the 3rd, the parish church, which is served by a victor and curates, and dedicated in the name of the Visitation of Our Lady. Modern, like the other 2, it is in the imitation of the Norman style, and though bare and inelegant, it contains an incomparable chapel, full of the spirits of St. Lydwine, whose relics, given by the Carmelites of Brussels, are preserved in it. This chapel, which is almost a miniature oratory, is nothing when described. Its charm lies in its atmosphere and not its shell, which, with its beams and its panels of white wood, looks like a temporary building, and it is certainly unfinished. It seems as though space has been lacking, and a little yard had been borrowed on with which to build the shrine. But it is the feeling of intimacy which this sanctuary gives, unspoiled by the gimcrack ornaments of the other churches, that appears to the pilgrim. There rises a very small altar of Gothic form, ornamented by a cross and passion flowers, and surmounted by a statue of the saint standing, to whom the angels offer roses. A statue inspired by the sculptor of the Primitives, the only really adequate one we have yet met in the country. On the front of the altar, which is framed in woodwork, a bas-relief in marble represents the saint again, but this time in a recumbent posture, and the angel bringing her the symbolic branch. In spite of its classic conception and its ordinary composition, this bas-relief, which is the work of M. Strock, a sculptor of Haarlem, is interesting, and whilst I examine it narrowly, I say to myself, where have I already seen this figure, enveloped in bandages, regarding a crucifix between his hands? Lydwine's heir, Sister Emmerich, appears before me, on her bed, as Clement Bretano drew her, and Edward's style engraved her. And I must say I think it is a truly ingenious idea of the artist who, not being able to consult any authentic portrait of the saint, drew his inspiration from the attitude and features of her more perfect image, her sister in God. Pictures by the artist Jan Duselman will complete the decoration of this chapel. 5 are already in place, and 3 are still to come. Amongst these compositions, which tell the principal events in Lydwine's life, one depicts the fall on the ice in a manner which recalls the work of Deleuze. In this picture, with the saint's little house of brick and wood, the door with large hinges, the window with heavy leadwork, the group of girls who surround the child prostrate in the snow, the men who are indifferent and walk about without realizing the gravity of the accident, and the old sweeper on the right, emerging at the cries of the girls distracted with fear. It is a good piece of work, wonderfully drawn and cleverly painted. I cannot, however, believe that little Lydwine had a long nose, prominent eyes, and vulgar mouth. In point of fact, she ought to have looked frightful in these pictures, for she was already thin and ugly before she broke her ribs. But while the artist was, in my opinion, quite right to neglect historical truth, for it would require genius to make spiritual splendor to appear through bodily squalor, yet I could have wished to have Lydwine imagined a both more intellectual and more delicate. She was pretty, well made, of an elegant figure, and her voice was soft and sweet. That is almost all we learn from her biographers. But, though little, it is enough to show that they intended to make her pleasanter and more refined than the artists have done. Truly, I believe for my own part, that I saw her one Sunday amongst the orphans of the Dominican sisters brought to Mass in that same church. She was kneeling, bending towards the altar, telling her beads. She had large, blue, almost green eyes, and under the black hood her admirable hair was visible. That hair, which, almost silver at the roots, becomes more golden at the tips, and might be likened to a skein of silk lit by a winter sun. The child's pose was so modest, so pious, so truly absorbed in God, with her fair skin just tinted with rose color in her cheeks, and her flower-like lips opened as if the frost had touched them, that I could not persuade myself that Lydwine would have differed from her in any way. As I have said, there is no authentic picture of Lydwine's features extant. Of the 20 pictures mentioned by Milanus, which formerly ornamented the walls of the chapel built in her honor by the rectors of Schiedam, 12 were reproduced in an insignificant form by the engraver Jerome Wierck in the 16th century, and surround, in medallions, a larger portrait of the saint receiving the famous branch from the hands of the angel. It is difficult to imagine anything more mean than this engraving. One does not know if Lydwine is a boy or a girl, if she grimaces like a hybrid being, whose prominent nose divides an absolutely chinless face. On the other hand, I have examined in a private house at Schiedam a very beautiful engraving by Valdor, dating from the beginning of the 17th century, which portrays her more sensibly, but neither is this she. Other feeble portraits by Pietre de Jode and Sebastian Leclerc exhibit her, either alone with her angel, brandishing a cross, a crown, or a twig of rose or a palm. At last, portrait, quite modern but interesting, in imitation of the primitive style, is the work of a German painter, Ludwig Sitz. It is one of the best, but in that, as in all others, the face is invented. We are at liberty, therefore, since nothing certain exists, to picture her according to our own conceptions of art and instincts of piety. On that Sunday, when I caught sight of the extraordinary little maiden, we could confirm the impressions of the town first made on us. The churches were too small to hold the crowd of worshippers. At the Visitation of Our Lady, the people read their missals before the open doors on the pavement. The communions never ceased. After the men and women and school children came forward. Nowhere have I ever observed such placid warmth, and, I may add, such an absolute respect for the liturgy. Plain chant, executed not by paid singers, but by volunteers, who acquitted themselves conscientiously of the task, and determined to sing well in honor of the Saviour. This little chapel of St. Lydwine comes to me as a tender memory in hours of sorrow. How can I forget the cordial and delicate welcome of the good and learned Victor, Monsieur l'Abbé Polka, who celebrated Mass for us one morning at her altar, on which he exposed the reliquary of her own fete day. Apart from these few bones and her memory which shines in the town, nothing, alas, remains of Lydwine except her tombstone. It has been taken from the old church, which is disaffected and converted into a Protestant temple, and transferred to a little chapel of the Dominican sisters, who have an orphanage and a school for the children of the poor. This stone is carved with the figure of a woman, old and asleep, the hands folded on the breast, and enveloped from head to foot in a shroud. From above 2 little angels descend to surround her head with a crown, and, at the 4 corners, the evangelical emblems are engraved in circles. This stone has been very well preserved. According to the Bollandists, the Calvinists turned it over, not to preserve it, but to prevent the Catholics from kneeling before it, while, according to another tradition, the Protestants, in deference to the saint, made a detour in the church so as not to walk over the stone and destroy it. I do not know which of these versions is true, but I give them for what they are worth. The building which it occupies is the subject of numerous controversies, which I will sum up in a few lines. According to some, Lydwine's house was situated in a little pathway called Bogerstraat, according to others, in a little street called Korkestraat. There was formerly in the street a well which healed fever cases and sick animals, and, according to ancient documents, one can recognize the dwelling of the saint by this sign. But although researches have been made, the well can no longer be discovered. A third opinion, which seems more likely, would assign her residence to the Lindendal, where there is a Protestant orphanage, a building of the 18th century, with the figure of a boy and girl carved and painted on each side above the door. This is at any rate the history of Lydwine's dwelling. After her death, the son of Dr. Godfrey de Haga bought the house, which became what was called a House of the Holy Spirit, that is to say, a refuge for poor women. Then, in 1461, on the day of the Fete of St. Gertrude, this house, which contained a chapel, was given by the College of the Holy Spirit, with the assent of the burgomasters and councillors of Schiedam, to a community of claresses, or Grey Sisters of St. Francis, who came from Haarlem. There was in this convent, says Molanus, an altar dedicated to St. Lydwine, at the place her bed had occupied, and from here was distributed every year, on Lydwine's fete day, a loaf of white bread to all who presented themselves, rich and poor alike. In 1572, the Gu, after having devastated the church of St. John the Baptist, demolished the chapel of the Leendal and pillaged the cloister. It became an orphanage in 1605 and was abandoned in 1779, for it then fell to ruin. But it was afterwards rebuilt, perhaps in the same place, that is to say, on the site of Lydwine's house. This last point, however, is not universally admitted. I do not wish to take part in this discussion, which is only of interest to those in Schiedam. I ought, however, to add that a fourth opinion was expressed to me in Amsterdam, which has the advantage of putting all the others in the right, namely, that Lydwine might have occupied many habitations, and would, in any case, have been transferred to her brother's house on the death of her father. I do not know how much of this statement may be worth. I see no trace of it in the historian's narrative, but it does suggest one comment. Brugman tells us that the house of Lydwine's father was low and damp, more like a tomb than a cottage. Now, I ask, how could so many people exist in such a cockleshell of a dwelling? After the death of her father, his son, wife, 2 children, a cousin called Nicholas, the Augustinian Gerlach, and finally widow Catherine Simon must all have lived there. It is very possible that they were not all there at the same time, but it is certain that this retreat must have been fairly large to shelter so many guests. It is, therefore, perhaps permissible to think that the house in which Lydwine died was not the same as that in which she was born, and lived during the first years of her sufferings. The location of the canal on whose ice she broke her rib is the subject of less discussion. The archaeologists seem to agree in pointing out a street which still bears the name of Lame Man's Lane, Kruppelstraat. This street was a canal not so very long ago, for I obtained a photograph in Schiedam which shows it as such, but it is difficult to imagine the exact place where the scene related by the biographers took place. In the days of Lydwine, nothing existed but the old church of St. John the Baptist, now belonging to the Reformed Church, but the saint never prayed there, since the sanctuary was burnt in the fire of 1428, and rebuilt, in part, during her life, at a time when she was confined entirely to her bed. This church, then the only one in Schiedam, is built of brick, and surmounted by a high-roofed tower, which has a little turret embellished by a very feeble carillon. The arches inside are supported by 7 pillars, with capital of sculpted leaves. Its ceiling has beams, and the nave is cut in two by an apron of wood. There are desks arranged as if for distribution of prizes, or to serve as the corn exchange, some benches, and a quantity of Bibles. The sadness of this polluted sanctuary without altar and without masses is indescribable. More than this basilica, more than in the streets of which I have spoken, the memory of Lydwine haunts you when you wander the old quarters of Schiedam, which are less rebuilt and less repaired. How often, along the shanty canals, whose bridges turn to allow strings of barges to pass, how often we have called up her image, whilst the great windmills bless the town with the crosses of their wings. They trace a circle of the Greek cross, and recall to my mind the memorial of the Passion, which Lydwine so ardently adored. And whilst these silent crosses bless the skies, in the distance a policeman, pleasant-looking in spite of his spiked hat and little sword, superintends the dock laborers, who, in red woolen clothes and short breeches, disembark barrels on the quay, while sailors pump brown streams of hot grain into the barges drawn up in front of the breweries. I, for my part, think of Lydwine's father, good old Pierre, who had been the watchman, the policeman of his day at Schiedam. Before us spread the waterways, planted with mills of the 18th century, superb in their red brick bridges, their great collars of wood, their little window frames painted apple green, their wings, sometimes without sails, like razor blades, ready to cut the air, and looking like giants by the side of the little ones which are built now. There are charming corners in this tiny city. In the old part, on the other side of the river Schie, to which the town owes its name, there's a network of little streets composed of smoke-blackened brick buildings, making quaint curves and designs in the water, which reflects them. Old tumble-down buildings, like the drying sheds of tan-yards, or the high facades surmounted by great roofs, which the seagulls touch as they fly. Suddenly, at the turn of one of these ways, immense spaces of country are revealed, plains intersected by canals, which seem to move with the clouds they reflect. Very far off, masts of ships, which we cannot see, seem to pierce the earth. A sail moves, and behind it appears the sweeps of a windmill, which it seems to have concealed. Cows, sheep, and pigs can be seen as far as the eye can reach, under an infinite expanse of sky. And while we look at this vegetation, so fresh and green, that in comparison the best watered meadows of France are yellow and dry, we contemplate the polar sky of pale blue with its little silver clouds which slowly turn to gold. A very sweet melancholy comes over us. These placid scenes, these quiet spaces, these solemn landscapes, have something personal about them, a nameless feeling of peace and love, and the charm of nature here offers a fellowship which smiles, perhaps a little sadly and reflectively. As a contrast to these plains and these little streets intermingled with narrow canals, there expands at the other end of the town a great stretch of water, the Meuse, which here flows into the sea. In the distance, Rotterdam emerges from the water, with her towers rising against the limitless sky. The little steamboats which serve the shores of town smoke on the horizon. The whistle of a vast candle factory dominates all other noises. The quay is bristling with steam packets and encumbered with barrels. This recall to modern life in Lydwine's country is disconcerting, and we begin to regret the time when the clumsy fishermen set fire to Schiedam on the eve of the day when they embarked from the shores, then empty and unoccupied, for the herring fishing. While speaking of fire, we should note that the saint, who endured 3 in her lifetime, is here considered even by the Protestants a savior from its ravages. And indeed, there has not been a single case of fire in an alcohol distillery where the adjacent houses have suffered. Lydwine is also, as is very natural, invoked for the cure of illness. From the cure's house is lent a little receptacle of silver containing a tiny relic, which with those who suffer, and every Monday at 7 in the evening they pray before benediction that Lydwine may avert epidemics from the town. She still lives at Schiedam, where the Catholics venerate her, and it must in justice be owned that the dissenters are not hostile to her. She possesses friends too at Haarlem, but further afield her memory is effaced. We have now spent nearly 12 days in the tiny city, and besides its exterior aspect, we begin to know its antecedents and penetrate its inner life. Schiedam was never a large town, but it was formerly a prosperous place. Now she is declining. The old rich families have gone. Her particular industry, the Schiedam gin, which takes its title from her, has been on the decline since large towns such as Antwerp have entered competition with her. She used to possess 300 distilleries, and now there are hardly 20. Where are the boats which used formerly to come from Norway with cargoes of blueberries? I have discovered none, and I am a little doubtful if the fruit of the juniper enters at all into the composition of the generous liquor. It seems to be concocted like Irish whiskey and Scotch gin from wheat, maize, and barley. And in all these streets, by all these canals, it is not the smell like matches of true juniper berries that we perceive, but the scent of hot linseed, of grain, of the dregs of hot barley. They throw out these things beside the factory in tanks along the quays, and there men pump them out and spread them in barges to serve as cattle food. The population of the town consists of about 13,000 of the Reformed Church, 10,000 Catholics, 60 or 7 Jansenists, and 200 Jews. The Catholics are therefore in a minority, as they are in most of the towns of the Low Countries, and this is doubtless why they keep together and form a little model colony of good and pious people. A Catholic who does not practice his religion, and is Catholic in name only, is rare here. There is nothing like having suffered for your religion to render it dear to you. And, if Calvinism has decimated the Saviour's lambs, one must own that it has strangely strengthened those who stood firm. The Catholicism of the Netherlands, as I observed it here, has nothing of that effeminacy which one finds among the Latin races. It adores a Christ on the cross, inseparable from the body, whom it does not relegate, as is so often with us, to a place after and below his saints. In a word, it is a simple and virile Catholicism, and it must be owned that in Holland the clergy are excellent. Dispensed from a subordinate education of our seminaries, strengthened by arduous study, they are not filled with those prejudices which make our ecclesiastics a class apart. The Dutch priest is a man like any other, mixing, like anyone else, in everyday life. He is more independent than with us. His existence is passed about in the open, and it is just because he has nothing obscure about him that he commands respect, even among dissenters, by the dignity of his life, by the fervor of his faith, by the recognized honesty of his priesthood. His task is not always the easiest. He must secure the safety of his flock, camped amidst infidels, and increase its numbers if he can. But in doing this he meets terrible obstacles, for it is but slowly that the Low Country returns to its original faith, because of the fervent defense of their religion by the Protestants, and the isolation of the converted. He must be a very exceptional man, therefore, who returns to the sheepfold. He must be able to do without the help of his old co-religionists, who, like the Jansenists, retain the money. For riches lie with the sects, especially with the Jansenists. Peret's box has some little ones, and these, for their encouragements, the prebends distribute to those who are married in their churches. It would not suit the Jansenists to foster a religion drawn from Port Royal, ascetic Christians sinning from excess of scruple. The disciples of Port Royal, who were certainly very interesting, no longer exists. Their successors are shamefully heterodox, debased Protestants, and if they sin, it is not by ultra-rigorism, but rather the other extreme. For Jansenius married, and Quenzel also took a wife. Thus Holland, which, with its Jansenist Archbishop at Utrecht, as the last refuge of the schism. For, if I may believe the clergy yearbook, there are a population of 4,800,000 inhabitants, 1,700,000 Catholics, or a little more than 35%, has been, nevertheless, a holy land, a greenhouse, in which the monastic culture was intensive. Dominicans, Augustinians, Franciscans, Croziers, Alexians, Chartreux, and Antonites built cloisters there and flourished in them. Frisia alone had 90 monasteries and abbeys, and in the single province of Utrecht, says Don Pietra, there have numbered 198 religious foundations. All have disappeared in the storm. In the county of St. Eloi and St. Willibrord, of St. Werenfried and St. Willahead, and of St. Boniface, of St. Ulfild, of St. Lydwine, the Catholic cult is maintained in spite of terrible persecutions. Instead of being submerged by the Reformed religion following the Confession of Calvin, it is actually extending. In 1897, a Dutch paper, the Catholic Workman, enumerated the Catholic institutions in the Low Countries thus: 96 religious housings, serving 66 parishes, and giving instructions in the school to 725 pupils. 44 brotherhoods tending the sick, aged, insane, orphans, deaf, and dumb, and teaching 1,035 boarders and 12,120 day scholars. 22 houses of religion vowed to the contemplative life. 430 houses of nursing sisters caring for 12,000 orphans, incurables, and blind. There are registered at this moment 592 convents in Holland. According to other statistics appearing in 1900 in the Resident Abode of The Hague, the Netherlands numbered, in 1784, 350 parishes and 400 priests. In 1850, 673 parishes and 975 priests. In 1860, 918 parishes and 1,800 priests. In 1877, 985 parishes and 2,093 priests. And in 1900, 1,014 parishes and 2,310 priests. The progress is slow but sure. The church is reoccupying little by little the soil that once was hers. The old seed buried in the earth which the Reformation dried up is rising. One can hear, they say, certain reeds springing up in the tropics. It seems as though we were to listen well in the Low Countries. We should hear the old bones and dust of her ancient saints stirring.